The very first American education law was written by the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. The Old Deluder Act required that any community, upon reaching a population of 50 families, hire a teacher. When the community grew to 100 households, they were then to build a school building. The Puritans understood the need for literacy, particularly to enable all citizens to be able to read the Scriptures for themselves in order to withstand the devil, or that old deluder Satan. The Old Deluder Act of 1647 predated the founding of America as a nation by more than 100 years, so it was not obviously an example of national government involvement in education. It was a local community effort that arose from the needs of local families, and it was focused only on teaching children to read, the most basic educational skill. Few of America's founding fathers received much of their education in an organized school setting. While some attended private schools, most were schooled at home by their parents or private tutors, or they were self-taught. Ben Franklin, for example, started school at the age of 8, then came home when he was 10 to assist in his father's business, and he learned mostly from his father, who, by the way, had very little or no formal schooling. Washington attended school for only 2 years, then taught himself. Jefferson studied with a private tutor. This was the early American pattern. Yet, as John Adams remarked in 1765, a native of America who cannot read or write is as rare an appearance as a comet or an earthquake. Schooling continued to be available for all who wanted it and pursued it. An 1830 article in the Philadelphia National Gazette said, "Education in general must be the work of the intelligence, need, and enterprise of individuals and associations. At present, in nearly all of the most populous parts of the United States, it is attainable for nearly all the inhabitants." Some New England schools were tax-supported under state law, but they had to compete with academically superior private academies. Education across most of the country, however, was completely laissez-faire. School attendance was voluntary, and schools were funded either privately or by charity. And what were the results of America's early education efforts prior to the rise of an organized school system? Well, according to the census of 1840, fully 90% of white adults were listed as literate. In 1860, that number had risen to 94%. By way of comparison, a 1993 U.S. Department of Education study showed that only 50% of American adults were moderately literate. In the early 1800s, changes in Europe led to state control of education there. Educational elites and intellectual leaders in America, particularly the Harvard Unitarians and followers of Robert Owen, were attracted to the idea, believing that placing all children in a centrally controlled institutional environment under the direction of the state would lead to a perfect society. It was the beginnings of socialism, even before the term was invented. These early American socialists were attracted to what was happening to education in Germany. The Prussian public school system had everything that they wanted: full state funding by involuntary taxation, teachers trained by the state, a standard state-prescribed curriculum, age-segregated classrooms with military-like discipline, compulsory attendance laws enforced by truant officers, and effective ways to keep independent-minded parents in check. Promoted first in liberal churches in New England, universal public education following the Prussian model soon became viewed as the best way to preserve America's Protestant majority from a flood of Catholic immigrants. Protestant denominations joined together on the basis of what they shared in common, hence the term common schools. But many did not realize that much of what they agreed to had a very different purpose, one that they would only begin to understand over a century later. And interestingly, after the American Civil War, Northern bankers and industrialists brought the Prussian model of schooling to the defeated South. Horace Mann, known as the father of American public education, oddly enough did not start out with any particular interest in education. His teaching experience was limited to 2 years as a tutor at Brown University just after his graduation from there. He went on to become a lawyer, then to serve in the Massachusetts state legislature. After his election in 1836, Massachusetts Governor Edward Everett set out to remake his state's education system after the Prussian model. As president of the Senate, Horace Mann led the passage of a new law that Everett wanted to allow him to appoint a state school board, effectively taking control of local schools out of the hands of local officials and placing it in the hands of the state. Everett then appointed Mann as the secretary of the new Massachusetts State School Board. Mann took on his new job with the zeal of a missionary, and he regarded the transformation of education into a state-controlled, tax-supported bureaucracy as a mission. Supported by wealthy, influential friends, Mann focused with the zeal of a martyr on the task of perfecting the human race and creating heaven on earth through universal state-run education. Abraham Lincoln had said, "The philosophy of the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy of politics, government, and life in the next." To determine the philosophy that would reign in the classroom, social planners and other supporters of state-run education had to determine who would be the teachers in the classroom and what the teachers would believe. To accomplish that, Mann concentrated on establishing teacher colleges known as normal schools. James G. Carter, in an 1825 pamphlet, called the first normal school at Lexington, Massachusetts, quote, "an engine to sway the public sentiment, the public morals, and the public religion more powerful than any other in the possession of the government," unquote. And it became a model that was visited, studied, and duplicated nationwide, though it contributed immediately to a reduced literacy by promoting the whole word method of teaching reading. Mann also set out to convince the middle and professional class to withdraw their children from private schools and to place them in the new common schools for the good of the entire society. He appealed to their religious sentiment first by pointing out that the common schools had first been set up for religious purposes, but he misrepresented what that purpose was, which was to teach children to read the Scriptures, not that they might perfect other children by forced association. Nevertheless, many parents bought the statist argument that their duty to their community was more important than their duty to their children, and the purpose of public schools as instruments of social change first and academics second was quickly established. Though parents may not have known it, they were fulfilling the wildest dreams of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, who wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848 that they wanted to stop the exploitation of children by their parents by destroying the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. They wrote that the hallowed correlation of parents and child between the family and education was disgusting bourgeois claptrap. The next big player who was instrumental in applying this socialist statist education system to America was John Dewey, who furthered the demise of the neighborhood school and promoted the takeover of education by big industry and government via psychologically experimental methods. Dewey, like Mann, clearly understood the religious element that is inherent within education. Our schools, he said, are performing an infinitely religious work. They are promoting social unity. Religion associated with dogmatic beliefs we see disappearing. It is the part of man to work for the transformation of all practical instrumentalities of education till they are in harmony with these ideas. Underscoring the importance of Mann's earlier initiative to have the state teach the teachers, Dewey described teachers in almost Messiah-like terms. Every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of heaven. After taking over the teacher colleges, the next thing that these education statists had to do was to take charge of the textbooks that our children learned from. Gary North points out that what the textbook contains is not so important as what it leaves out. It leaves out evidence of rival views. The war for the minds of the next generation has been more carefully laid out by textbook committees than by any consortium or conspiratorial meeting behind closed doors. The textbook committees control by elimination. George Orwell wrote in his eerily accurate book, 1984, "Whoever controls the image and information of the past determines what and how future generations will think. Whoever controls the information and images of the present determines how these same people will view the past." Lester Frank Ward, the father of American Central Planning, who called education a systematic process for the manufacture of correct opinions, laid down the design template for school textbooks using this exclusion method. Our minds, he said, resist coercion to change our deep-seated opinions. But if educators, particularly those who wrote the textbooks that all schools would use, would eliminate any mention of competing ideas, nothing would be left in our minds but those opinions that the educators want us to have. And what ideas did those educators want us to have? Why, that there's nothing more important for us to learn while we are young than that which is necessary for us to go out, get a good job, and become productive members of society. Elsewhere in this course, you learn about a group of politicians, bankers, and businessmen who met in secret in 1913 on Jekyll Island, and how that meeting quite radically changed life in America. At around the same time as that fateful visit to Jekyll Island, many of these same players who gave us the Federal Reserve System were involved in other business ventures besides banking. They realized that they needed a cooperative, submissive, and well-trained workforce in order to accomplish their goals. Schools, then, were to play a vital role in producing these workers. In 1917, another meeting took place involving many of the same players, names like Rockefeller and Carnegie, that just as radically changed life and lifelong opinions in America by altering the direction of government-controlled schooling. This group, the Education Trust, included not only big players from the world of finance and big business, but also from the world of education. Names like Harvard and Stanford and the National Education Association. And their purpose, according to British evolutionist Benjamin Kidd, was to impose on the young the ideal of subordination. As former New York State Teacher of the Year John Taylor Gatto described it, students were to learn to think of themselves as employees competing for the favor of management, not as Franklin or Edison had once regarded themselves as self-determined free agents. No longer were rugged individualism and Yankee entrepreneurialism to be regarded as the strength and pride of America. Instead, young people were taught that their strength was to be found in submission to the greater good of the group, or as a backwards look at history shows, to the manpower needs of industrialists who had invested huge amounts of capital in new machinery that required factory workers to operate. And a new term was born: human resources. Yes, there has been, for almost the past 100 years, a deliberate effort made to actually use education to captivate the majority of American citizens to a working-class existence. Charlotte Iserby writes in The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, "The mind of the average American became trained or conditioned to accept the idea that education exists solely for the purpose of getting a good job in the global workforce economy." School, according to John Taylor Gatto, was looked upon from the first decade of the 20th century as a branch of industry and a tool of governance. But did it stop then, after the era of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies? Hardly. The U.S. Department of Labor under the first Bush presidency released a statement that said, "All schools must bend single-mindedly to the task of socializing a skilled workforce." So the history of education in America tells a story of the takeover of our schools, first by socialists who saw government as the way to assure universal compliance with their plan to perfect mankind and to produce a heaven on earth, and then by big business and banking interests who saw the government-controlled schools as a means to always have a willing and compliant workforce. Most citizens today have been brought up in a government-controlled school, and now they have almost inbred in them the idea that education is properly a natural role of the government. The government certainly wants us to continue to think that way, for it believes that it also has a vital role to play in educating our children. According to Stanford University political science professor Rob Reich, the state has an independent interest in education for citizenship that may not be shared by parents. What is that independent interest? Well, the U.S. Department of Education says that education is a means to achieve important economic and social goals of a national character. The economic goals are to satisfy the demands of industry by keeping a steady stream of workers graduating and flowing into the world's widget factories. The social goals, which remember were the first reason given to bring the schools under the control of the state, are to satisfy the social liberals among us who believe in the perfectibility of man and the attainment of a heaven on earth. Remember, according to Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, it takes a village to raise a child. And if some other member of the village has a different opinion about what we should do with our children and their education and upbringing, we could well be outvoted. But we already are being outvoted. According to William Sewell, professor of education at the University of Virginia, each child belongs to the state. What is the state's goal for the education of our children? Professor Sewell identified it when he described the purpose of education as, quote, the training of citizens for the state so the state may be perpetuated, unquote. Just as it takes trained human resources to keep an industry alive, so it takes trained cooperative subjects to keep the state alive. State control of education is not some new plan that was just formulated yesterday. It's been around quite a while, and it is certainly not unique to America. And it was not found only in Germany before it was brought here. Fascist dictator Benito Mussolini of Italy also had a pretty good handle on state-run education when he said, "At every hour of every day, I can tell you on what page of which book each schoolchild in Italy is studying." And whether or not we as parents like the idea of the state dictating what our children should learn and controlling how our tax dollars are spent that pay for this education, that is exactly the program that is now being carried out in every tax-supported school in America. Professor Reich sees three parties with an interest in education: the parents, the state, and the child himself. But he says that parental authority must end when its exercise compromises the development of minimal autonomy in children. If parental authority over education does not conduce to the self-sufficiency and independence of their children, the state must step in and ensure such outcomes. This is the statist view, that in the education equation, only the state is sovereign.